Have you ever struggled with anxiety? Chances are that you have. According to the World Health Organization, anxiety disorders are among the most common mental disorders affecting over 301 million people in 2019 alone, most of these being women. Now, I'm curious, when you think about anxiety that you felt in your lifetime, either currently or recently, have you ever noticed that your anxiety is tied to your cravings for sugar? Perhaps your anxiety leads you to want more sugar, or perhaps when you eat more sugar, you notice your anxiety getting worse. If this is the case, this episode is for you, as together we're going to explore this link between anxiety, sugar addiction, and your own inner healing journey. Before we get into this amazing conversation today, huge shout out to everybody who has taken a moment to support me in this show by leaving a 5-star review. It means the absolute world to me to hear your feedback, but also to help me reach more people. More reviews equals more people to the algorithm here in podcast land. And I just deeply appreciate any of you who have taken a chance to leave a 5-star review here on the show, either on Apple or Spotify. If you haven't done that yet and you'd love to support me and help me get this message out to even more women who need it, go ahead and pause this episode right now and head over and write a review. All right, so let's go ahead now and dive into today's deep, beautiful conversation about the connection between anxiety and sugar addiction. Welcome to the Beyond Sugar Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Dame, holistic nutrition coach and speaker. Let's dive in. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Your hostess with the mostess here, Danielle Dame, coming for another powerful episode. And I'm deeply looking forward to this conversation. Now, I want to preface this by saying I'm not an anxiety expert, but I am a human who has struggled with anxiety. And I'm going to share a little bit about my journey in this and in my own healing journey with sugar, deeply being tied to my healing journey with my anxiety. So I want to just open up a conversation here and plant some seeds today for all of you who have ever struggled with anxiety or know somebody who does, because this is something that is becoming more and more prevalent. And I see this, we're not going to go down this rabbit hole today, but with our younger generation as well, like anxiety brought on by social media and comparison and, all the processed food and all the stuff. There's a lot of things that are really amplifying the anxiety in our culture. And it's not something that's necessarily going away fast, but it is something that we can begin to understand the potential link that it has to our struggles with sugar. For me, there was a link, and I'm going to show more about this. And I'm curious for you if there's a link. So before we dive into all that, let's talk a little bit about what is anxiety. Again, I'm not a clinical psychologist and I haven't studied anxiety my whole life, but in my own terms, right? Anxiety for me, I encourage you to definitely define this for you, is a deep sense of worry, right? A deep sense of nervousness or excessive fear, and often shows up as a fear of the unknown, right? We worry about something that is future based. Worry tends to be something future based. We're worried about something happening or not happening in the future. We don't worry so much about the past or the present moment. Those are other things that show up there. But when we're talking about anxiety, it's usually anxiousness about something happening in the future. And of course, there's varying degrees of anxiety. I know I even did in preparation for this podcast, looked up some things on anxiety, and they're talking a lot about anxiety disorders, right? And these actually like clinically diagnosed disorders when it comes to people living with like extreme anxiety. But there's also a whole range of us who are living with mild anxiety or occasional anxiety, right? Maybe it's social anxiety, right? Or different types of anxiety, test anxiety, showing up in different areas of our life. That's not necessarily something that's ready to be clinically diagnosed. So just understanding that there's varying degrees of anxiety and they all warrant attention and support from us. Now, one thing that I want to add here is we're talking about kind of defining anxiety. And this just came to me before hitting record to this episode, because I've had this thought before that, like, why are women more prone to anxiety? Why are women more prone to worrying about the future? And personally, I believe that there is an innate because I'm a worrywart, FYI. This has been a big part of my journey. I worry a lot and about things that haven't happened. And it's easy for me to go there and get lost there if I let myself get lost in that tailspin. And I believe that there is an innate, like primal blueprint built into women specifically, as we are in charge of, not fully in charge. Obviously, the masculine is in charge and the men in our lives are here to support, but of keeping our young alive. There's almost this like needing to be prepared for the future or know what's coming in the future in order to keep my young, my offspring safe. Right. There's almost like this motherly protective energy that I've picked up in myself. And I feel like maybe an innate part of just one of our gifts that also becomes a curse as a woman of like future casting or thinking, planning ahead, right? Women tend to be better planners, thinking ahead about things versus just in the moment. And I think that's a primal thing. My belief is that there's something there around needing to like keep our children safe, making sure that they can be nurtured, making sure there's no immediate dangers. Obviously, the fathers and male figures here in the situation play a role in safety for the family unit, of course, as well. But I think there's something going on for women here that's a little bit different. So that's my own musing, my own rambling. Take it or leave it. And if anybody has any research that like proves that either way, I'd love to hear it. Send it my way, because I'm that's just an intuitive hit that I've had, and I'm very curious about how that plays into why women carry more of that anxious burden than men do. So that's a little bit about anxiety, but how does anxiety actually show up in the body? As you know, everything that I love to talk about here is what's going on in the body, right? And for all of us and anyone listening to this who struggle with anxiety, right, it's going to probably show up maybe a little different or maybe the same. But there are some overarching themes when we look at anxiety and how do I actually know that I'm feeling anxious or I'm feeling worried about something. Often your heart rate increases. Often you'll have a sensation. Some people describe it as like a heaviness or like a whirling in the chest or in your gut. You may get like hot and cold flashes. There's often an increase of breath in the chest when our nervous system is dysregulated, which, FYI, being in an anxious state is a nervous system activation response. We breathe mostly in our chest. So we'll notice that if we're feeling anxious about something, if you think about having a panic attack, right, which is like extreme anxiety attack, we're going to be breathing into our chests, usually short, rapid breaths, like not deep, nourishing breaths, right? So your breath is going to change and you're most likely going to be unable to think rationally, right? Or concentrate on certain tasks, right? If you have anxiety and you're trying to do a test, right? Everything's going to be a blur. You probably won't even see the question. Like we kind of go into an altered state of consciousness when we're deep in anxiety. Of course, if it's low lying anxiety, that might not show up. Now, as I mentioned before, I have quite a history with anxiety. This is something that showed up for me at a very young age as what I would describe as separation anxiety. So my anxiety showed up probably when I was about, well, it started early, according to my mom. I don't remember, but I remember it really peaking and being really bad in middle school. So I would have been in like grade 6, 7, 8-ish. And this was a time where it just really amplified. And I remember having terrifying thoughts of my mom not picking me up from school and that feeling like it was going to be the end of the world, right? Like there was just this doom and gloom. Like if she doesn't pick me up, then I'm alone. And I don't know where my mind went at that point, but there was a lot of separation anxiety. Actually, thinking back to when I was even younger, I spent a lot of nights in bed with my mom. I would go to bed in my bed and then I would get anxious and I would have to sleep in her bed at night. There was a lot of separation anxiety and a lot of like what I know now, energetic fear of being alone and being isolated and not being understood and not being actually emotionally connected to. There was a lot of disconnection that I felt in my upbringing, energetically and emotionally, from my caregivers, and that left me feeling unsafe. And that's ultimately what anxiety is. A little teaser. We're going to get to that. But this is something that I've been through. And as I mentioned earlier as well, I have such a propensity to worry. I'm a big worrier. I love worrying about the future. It never serves me. And it's something that I'm constantly working on and have come so far in releasing. And I'll share more about like how I've done that and what are some of the tools that I've used to support me in that. But it's important that you know this is something that I've been through. And I know a lot of my clients, a lot of you listening, struggle with anxiety to this day. And I want you to know you're not alone. I know that this anxiety struggle is real, and it's really challenging for each of us to navigate our way through that. Now, my curiosity in this episode is this. Is your anxiety leading to your sugar dependency, or is your sugar dependency leading to your anxiety? Chicken or the egg? Which comes first? I'm really curious. So let's explore this a little bit. Let's break it down a little bit. The first one, right? Is your anxiety, does the anxiety that you feel for some whatever reason, is that the reason that you are dependent and addicted on sugar? So, of course, anxiety causes such a physiological reaction in the body, right? It's flushing our body full of stress hormones, which could no doubt pose that it drives us to reach for sugar to soothe, right? To comfort these uncomfortable feelings. Anxiety feels really uncomfortable. We talked about that, shortness, breath in the chest, maybe you're hot, cold, maybe you're getting like heavy sensations in your chest and in your stomach. There's all sorts of things that can show up with anxiety, right? That can feel really uncomfortable in the body, thus making sense that we would want to get away from that, right? We would want to soothe with something, and sugar often feels good for a minute in the body, right? We could also say that because of the physiological response that shows up when we're feeling anxious, we have increased energy needs, right? There's more energy pulsing through our body, feeling this anxiety. Perhaps those energy needs could also lead to sugar cravings, right? And of course, we know stress in the body, no doubt, causes so many of us to reach for sugar, both for a physical reason, but also for an emotional escape. So clearly here, experiencing the emotion of anxiety and the sensations of anxiety in our body can lead to us wanting to eat sugar, wanting us to soothe, to use sugar to cope in an addictive or dependent way. Makes sense. But many who struggle with sugar addiction don't necessarily resonate with struggling with anxiety. So it's not 100%, right? This isn't a clear, direct link that everyone with anxiety thus has sugar addiction issues. That's not always the case. So let's look at the other side, right? Is your sugar dependency leading to anxiety? When we eat sugar, we know it does things to our brain and cells that makes us momentarily feel happy, right? We have this euphoric dopamine hit momentarily when we eat junk food, when we eat sugar. And then we have the inevitable sugar crash, which is known to lead to all sorts of emotional struggles, including depression, anxiety, heart palpitations, low energy. Like, so much happens on that sugar crash, right? And I think all of us here listening to this podcast has experienced this before. So eating all these, over-consuming sugar, being dependent on sugar, processed food, right, could absolutely make sense, lead to this higher rates of anxiety, right? When we're on the come down, right? When we're struggling afterwards. But here's the catch. Not everyone with anxiety experiences sugar cravings because of that anxiety. So now we can make cases for both of these, right? For anxiety leading to sugar dependency and sugar dependency leading to anxiety. And perhaps it's not black and white. And perhaps there's a case that it's both. And in my experience, in my opinion, it is both, with more of a likelihood being that your anxiety is actually leading to your sugar dependency. And then being amplified again on the other side of this by the sugar that you're then using to attempt to cope. So this is my hypothesis and my proposition, and what I've seen in my practice is that often the underlying emotional component is driving the addictive behavior, and our inability to cope with or manage any sort of difficult emotional experience that is rooted in nervous system dysregulation and trauma will then lead us into these addictive coping mechanisms with sugar. And we can't ignore that the more sugar and crap we eat, the more we're going to feel anxious. it's going to amplify perhaps a challenge or a struggle that already exists. So it's a vicious cycle. This is one big loop, right? Of all of this being so deeply connected and deeply challenging. So my curiosity then becomes, what's the root of anxiety? This conversation goes beyond sugar, right? If we can understand that our inner world, as we've talked a lot about on this podcast, and hopefully you're all very familiar, right, with our inner world being the direct root cause of our external behaviors, sugar addiction being one of them, right? It might be a wine addiction, it might be a shopping addiction, it might be other really self-sabotaging behaviors, right? So here we're talking specifically about anxiety. So what is the root of anxiety? Right? We think about a lot of pieces of like, why does anxiety exist? Why does anxiety show up in our body? Now, again, I'm sharing this from my personal experience and from the experiences that I've had with working with clients over the last 9 years. And what I've seen is that most of my clients do struggle with anxiety. There does tend to be a higher rate of people who are coping and using sugar to numb out who struggle with anxiety. But it's the same for, I'd say, any addiction. The anxiety is one of these pieces that shows up for us because of deeper core wounding. And a lot of this will sound very similar to conversations that we could have around depression or other mental health challenges, right? It literally is, in my opinion, what flavor you just manifested, right? And perhaps for you, that's like being depressed a lot. Perhaps for you, it's being anxious a lot. Perhaps for you, it's just engaging in unhealthy relationships. Like we all have a different flavor of how our dysregulated nervous systems manifest into the world that we live in. So anxiety is just one of these examples, but we could easily be having the same discussion about depression. When we talk about anxiety and we're talking about maybe unearthing some of the roots of anxiety, when we think about this fear of the future, right? Fear of future events or things happening or not happening, which to me is a fear of the unknown. Right? When we have anxiety, we're feeling current fear or worry about something that hasn't happened yet and something that we may not feel like we have control over. There's a control aspect here, right? If we feel like we don't have control over your boss's decision at work or what's going to show up on that test at school, right? We don't know what the future is going to hold. There's a sense of like the unknown being terrifying. The unknown is scary. The unknown is unsafe, and it is something that we cannot control. Thus, it's just amplified. So when we look at anxiety, in my opinion, it is really a deep sense of feeling unsafe in our nervous system, which comes from our early childhood experiences and the trauma imprints in our nervous systems that we all carry. So there is at some level a deep sense of it is not safe to either be here in this world, in my community, in my house, in my body. It's not safe to be me. There's something here, a core wounding, core belief, or multiple core woundings and beliefs that are leading to an inability to trust the future, an inability to trust in the universe, trust in ourselves and society. And we feel like, so in my experience, in my example, I'll share my personal example, right? When this anxiety really showed up for me, it was a fear of being left alone and abandoned. It was a fear of abandonment and being left alone. And my primitive brain would then go, well, then I'll die, right? So there's a very real anxiety of future events not happening and thus causing me harm. And I didn't have any trust in myself, in my emotions, in the universe, in our society. I didn't really obviously trust my parents to the level that I could have to help me feel safe in that. So what I did as a coping mechanism from this feeling of unsafety, not feeling secure, nervous system dysregulation, is I then went and attempted to control everything. So my defense mechanism was to attempt to plan, control, and organize my whole life. So I needed to know exactly what time my mom was picking me up from school, where she was picking me up. I started making lists. I started organizing. I started getting really clear on like what's happening at school tomorrow. I needed to know all the details. And really, my attempt to control this situation was an attempt to help myself feel more safe, which is hilarious. I look back at that little girl now and I laugh because, of course, we can't control the universe. We can't even control our days or what time the bus is going to come or traffic. So, what time my parents are showing up. Like, control is a total illusion. But for me, it was what I thought I needed to get through and to feel safe. But instead, over the years, as I developed and grew out of this, I noticed that my need to control everything and people and my situations and my trips and all the things and plan everything actually was causing me more anxiety. Because as we all know, when you plan to fail, right? Nothing ever goes according to plan. This is God's greatest hilarious joke, right? We can plan all we want, a trip or a date or an event, and something always happens that's off plan. And then that thing, when that would happen, would cause me even more anxiety. So I was stuck in this loop where I thought I was coping by controlling things, right? Which in my later years turned into coping with sugar, right? And using that as a control mechanism for my anxiety, which then just led me back to feeling more anxiety in the first place. So obviously, the loop was not supportive. And I think for most of you listening to this, you're probably in a loop as well. Like there is some sort of deeply rooted coping mechanism that you developed, and it may just be sugar. It may have been control. It may have been something else, right? To find some sort of way to help you be less afraid about the future, right? Help you be less anxious about future events. And I'm willing to bet that coping mechanism is actually coming back and even causing you more anxiety, as it did to me, right? I mean, sugar is a great example of that as well, right? We're using sugar to cope with anxiety, and then the sugar crash causes more anxiety, right? It's just a loop. So we need to really understand that if you want to get out of a life of constant chronic anxiety, right? Or even occasional anxiety, you need to start diving deeper into why that anxiety exists for you. What is it that you are actually afraid of? What is it you're feeling unsafe around? We could pick another example here. I know I have some friends with social anxiety. Like being in big crowds or going to parties with people they don't know is just terrifying. And in this, I would pose that there's a fear of not belonging, a fear of being judged, a fear of just really like feeling like an outcast. Like there's a huge important part of all of us that needs to fit in, right? And needs to belong. And if we're in a situation where there's a bunch of people and it's unknown and it's scary, right? I'm willing to bet some of those woundings would show up, right? That, oh, I've never actually felt like I belong, right? Or I've never actually felt like people get me, right? And we can look at that experience and say, okay, what is it about meeting new people that feels so scary? And start unpacking the stories that we're telling ourselves there. That's going to give you the wisdom and insight into what's really going on underneath the anxiety, and beginning to bring that back perhaps to childhood, right? Were you ever, part of a group? Did you ever feel like you belonged? Was it always hard for you to make friends, right? That would make sense now as it's showing up for you in like feeling uncomfortable in social situations. So this is just one thread. I'm just vamping here as we're talking, but there's so many different threads. I'm not saying that's your case. If you have social anxiety, that's what's happening. There's probably lots happening. And I encourage you to explore it. What I want here is to plant that seed for each of you to begin being curious about what is the root of your anxiety, right? And I'm continuing to unpack mine, continuing to notice, when I worry, when I get anxious, like what is being triggered here? What is showing up? What old wound has caused me to fear the future? And I know for me, a big part of that has been learning to let go of control to alleviate some of that anxiety that comes from nothing going according to plan, and learning how to trust again. This is big. And I've done episodes on this. You can go back and find those around how to trust ourselves, how to trust the universe. Because when we trust, we don't have to worry about the future. Right? When I trust in my resiliency, I don't have to worry about a challenge that's coming up because I know with every cell of my body that I can handle it, that I can handle any challenge that's put in front of me because I trust my resiliency and I trust my inner guidance. I trust my support systems. I trust my society, my community. If there is a level of trust here, we don't have to feel anxious. So I would pose, that the next phase of this is even just talking about how do we begin to navigate out of anxiety or coping with anxiety. And I think this piece around trust is a major part of it. Learning how to trust again. Now, there's no blueprint to learn how to trust again. There isn't. But beginning to reflect on this may be a good place to start. Why don't I trust myself? Why don't I trust the future? Right? And a lot of us have a lot of reasons not to. Right? We look at the world. If you watch the news, gosh, help you, right? Definitely going to be something that stimulates your anxiety, right? If we're news watchers, you're going to see nothing but horrible things happening in the world. And that is terrifying, right? There's wars happening and injustices and murders and all the things. And of course, your brain is going to worry then about that happening to you, right? Or ones you love. So when we don't trust our government, our society, ourselves, we're going to feel more anxious. So that's step one is beginning to explore trust. Explore this idea of trust, explore what it is about the unknown of the future that worries you so much. What's the story there, right? If I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow at this event or on that date tomorrow, right? I'm going on a blind date, right? Like, I don't know what's going to happen, or is he going to like me, right? Maybe there's some thoughts there. So start paying attention to your thoughts, and then work on healing your root cause of your nervous system dysregulation. So this is, everything that I'm talking about here on the show now comes back to nervous system, right? This is really understanding that our emotional responses and mental challenges are stemming from nervous system dysregulation, trauma, stemming from our early childhood experiences that have shaped every cell in our body, every belief in our brain, and every emotion that is dragging us down. And learning how to actually move through these healing experiences and learning how to teach your nervous system how to regulate is absolutely key when we're dealing with anxiety and a lot of other things, right? Because anxiety is going to come up. I've been working on it for years. It still shows up. It's not there often anymore, but it still shows up. And now I know how to notice my nervous system become dysregulated. And with the tools that I've tapped into over the years, bring myself back into regulation, honor that emotion, come back to my breath, ground back into my body, and come back into a trusting and calm state. Sometimes this takes an hour, sometimes this takes minutes, sometimes it takes days. It depends. It depends on what's going on and what other things are going on in my life, for sure. But this nervous system work is so important. And in that process, you're going to learn how to reconnect to your body and reconnect to your breath. Deep, nourishing breaths into your belly, right? When we're talking about anxiety or worry or any really intense emotion, your breath is going to be your best friend, right? We've often heard it, right? Take 3 deep belly breaths, right? When you're feeling stressed. So this is the same sort of idea, right? We're supporting our body and physically re-regulating itself. And the more work you do on healing your underlying patterns, the easier these tools will become, right? It'll take just a couple minutes to re-regulate versus a week, right? And as you do this work as well, you're going to reconnect with yourself. And this is a big part of it. And I've talked a lot about trust already, but I know for me, learning who I really was, trusting my intuition, discovering my own resiliency, right? For example, when I was a kid, right? My mind just didn't go there. Like, okay, so if my mom doesn't pick me up from school, I'm capable of going back inside and asking the secretary to borrow her phone and call my mom, or go inside and find an adult to hang out with and sit and do some homework until mom shows up. Like, these are not horrible options for my mom being late to pick me up from school. But to me, I couldn't think of those at the time, right? I was like, it was all or nothing. Like, I was stuck in this anxiety loop of, my mom doesn't pick me up, I'm going to die. Like, essentially, that's what's going on. It's laughable, but in my brain and in my body, more likely, that's what was happening. But as I built more of a relationship with myself and my resiliency and built my own self-confidence, and oh, okay, here's how I could handle this situation. If she doesn't show up to pick me up, I'm going to be okay. Right. And these are some of the beautiful, important pieces to bring into this work as well, is remembering, finding mantras and remembering you're going to be okay. Right. And finding ways to really keep yourself in that energy. For each of you, that's going to be different. There might be a different sentence or mantra that you want to use, or different tool. So finding tools that support you. And that may for now be, coming back to our example from a couple minutes ago of social anxiety, that maybe just avoiding large crowds for now. Maybe what's supportive for you as you learn how to regulate and you start doing your healing journey with anxiety, maybe for now you need to just honor that that's not a space that you feel safe while you unpack why, right? And start healing why. You don't have to continue putting yourself in those spaces. Perhaps there's tools that really resonate with you, like nature, right? Or even giving yourself time to work on projects. I know for me, I used to get a lot of uh, pressure anxiety, right? If something needed to be done in 5 minutes, I would immediately block up and just couldn't function. So giving yourself time, if that resonates for you, it's like, oh, okay, I usually get anxiety about making dinner because I have to have it done in 10 minutes or my family's cranky. Right, great. Start earlier, or tell your family dinner's going to be at 7 instead of 6. Like, do what you can to set yourself up to give yourself space and time to complete tasks if task anxiety is something that shows up for you. Set up a support system, right? Finding other people to talk to about this stuff. Please work with a somatic therapist, work with, somebody who understands the nervous system and can really support you in doing this deeper healing. So, so potent, so, so powerful. So there's no one way, right? The question here being, how do we cope with anxiety? How do we heal from anxiety? There's no one way. But every mental health disorder that you're being challenged with, or friends and family has some sort of root in those early childhood situations, and our nervous system dysregulation and imprints from trauma, from those events that really shaped our internal world, and I believe lead to some of us anxiety, some of us depression, some of us addiction, some of us all of it, some of it, so all of these disorders that are being clinically diagnosed, right? We could even go as far as saying ADHD, ADD, like all of this being really derived from the energetic blueprints we all carry in our bodies, not in our brains, in our bodies. And it's fascinating when we start to begin unpacking those and finding new levels of, as I mentioned earlier, trust, resiliency, but also tools for ourselves. So you'll have to find your tools, and what may work for you now might not work for you next year. What worked for me as a child doesn't necessarily work for me now. And I've learned how to set my life and myself up to be less caught up in these anxiety loops and to be more trusting of the future, and surrounding myself with positivity, with good people, with community, with support, nature, and obviously my breath, and all these beautiful tools that I have that support me on a daily basis. And I encourage you to start discovering those. But it ultimately starts by you beginning to get curious without judgment about where your anxiety is actually coming from. Because yes, it's being amplified by sugar, by social media, by the news, by processed food. It's being amplified by a lot of things that exist in our society, EMFs, bright lights. Like, there's a lot of things that amplify our mental struggles or the challenging emotions we may feel, and anxiety being one of those. But they're not really why the anxiety exists in the first place. So this is your opportunity and your call here as we wrap things up to begin this exploration of what is really underlying your anxiety. What are you really afraid of? And what are you really feeling unsafe about? Is it unsafe to be you? Is it unsafe to speak your truth? A great example of this, right? If you're carrying around a belief that my voice doesn't matter, and, kids are meant to be seen and not heard, right? That I need to be quiet to be liked. you're probably going to have anxiety around public speaking, right? There's going to be some major blocks around your voice. And now if you have to give a speech in front of work, you're going to feel anxious. So this makes sense. So you can start to unpack, why do I feel so unsafe using my voice? Right? There's clearly something there. I've shared lots of examples, lots of curious channels for you to investigate. So I'm going to leave it at that and just leave this seed with all of you to begin exploring. Your action item is to pull out your journal and get curious. What's my anxiety telling me? What do I feel unsafe about? Right? What am I afraid of happening or not happening? Right? Often that's a thing, right? I'm afraid of failing this test, or I'm afraid of, not doing well, these sorts of things. And the more you become curious about it, the more you can begin to understand yourself and understand a clearer picture of where your healing needs to go next. And that's the whole point, right? When we have this self-awareness and introspective attitude, we can understand, okay, these are some things that I'm ready to work on now, or not. You can work on them later, right? But at least having that understanding for yourself will move you forward. And from there, you can begin to explore how you do that. Hire a somatic therapist, do psychedelic therapy, go to breath work, find a community, right? Get out in nature, all the things, right? There's so many ways that we can heal our core wounds that ultimately don't just create anxiety in our lives, but also create a whole plethora of other challenges like sugar addiction, right? And relationship issues and people-pleasing tendencies, and they're all connected. It's all connected. And you're definitely not alone in this. This is extremely common, right? 301 million people, mostly women, in 2019, which is an outdated statistic. So it's more than that by now. This is a massive problem, and we need to figure out the tools that work for us if we actually want to feel calm and grounded and happy and joyful and free in our everyday lives. So that is my hope and wish for all of you. I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you so much for tuning into another episode here on the show. I'm so grateful for each of you following along. And again, those who have left a 5-star review, thank you, thank you, thank you. It means the world to me. And I look forward to seeing you all on the next episode. See you then. Thanks for tuning in to another episode. If you're loving what we talked about today, please remember to subscribe, leave a 5-star review, and share this episode with someone you love. It helps me incredibly reach more people and help more women who need this information. And if you're ready to go deeper into discovering your unique root causes and patterns keeping you hooked on sugar year after year, be sure to come and check out the brand new free root cause quiz that will give you actionable items to finally begin healing your relationship with sugar from the inside out. You can find the link to download this quiz and other amazing resources in the show notes below. I also wanted to just take a quick minute to share a disclaimer. The information provided in this podcast is for general purposes only and is not at all intended to be professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. And as much as I do my best to bring you up to date and accurate information, please remember that I'm also sharing my opinions, stories, and ideas that are ultimately not supported by mainstream science. My personal advice should not be taken as professional advice, and you are always encouraged and advised to consult with your own healthcare practitioner before making any changes to your health and wellness routine. This podcast is intended to inspire and offer you alternative views to healing your relationship with food, mind, and body. It is up to each listener to take responsibility for their own health and wellness decisions. I hold no liability or responsibility for your results or lack thereof. Thanks for tuning in to the Beyond Sugar Freedom podcast, and we can't wait to see you in the next episode. Let's go.